On the 13th of May, 1607, 3 English ships dropped anchor at the site of what would become the country's first permanent settlement in the Americas, Jamestown. Picked for the defensive advantage of the slimy, salty waters which circled it at 3 sides, the land was fortified rapidly. The Virginia Company's 104 settlers worked without pause for a month, breaking only to fend off minor attacks from hunters of the Powhatan Confederacy, a group of 30 tribes living in territory stretching north and south across the bay of modern-day Virginia and west to the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. This initial hostility was well-founded. The ground claimed by the settlers was long used for hunting, and past meetings with cruel, violent Spanish explorers, a portent of what was to come. The colonists, however, were not deterred, and by the 15th of June their fort was completed. A triangle of wooden walls, buttresses housing artillery at its angles, peered out over the waters of the newly christened James River. A few days later, on the 25th of June, a Powhatan messenger walked beneath its shadow to deliver the word of peace. In the purple haze of dusk, on the 15th of January 1919, a group of 5 men marched to a building on Mannheimer Street in Berlin, amid the crushed embers of the German Revolution. Under orders from the ruling German Social Democrat Party and the direction of an anonymous tip, the men stormed the building without warrant. They left with 2 of the revolution's leading lights, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and drove them to the Hotel Eden, headquarters of the Freikorps, a volunteer paramilitary loyal to the collapsed German Empire. Liebknecht was first, a brief interrogation followed by a rifle butt to the face. His bled-out body, eviscerated by a single bullet hole, was left at the morgue beside Berlin Zoo. Luxemburg followed. As she walked through the revolving doors, a hurried interview lodged in her memory. A rifle struck at the back of her head. She was to be delivered to another Eden. Her unconscious body was driven to the Cornelius Bridge, which crests the Landwehr Canal. A single bullet was delivered to her temple, severing her head from her jaw. Germany's workers might have felt as if their brains and mouth were cut in 2 by this vicious lead. Rosa's body drifted silently in the canal's twinkling waters, alighted only by the shuddering of street lamps.
Tell you fascists, you may be surprised. People in this world are getting organized. You're bound to lose bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. There's people of every color marching side by side, marching across the field where a million fascists died. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. I'm going into this battle. Take my Union gun. We'll end this world of slavery. When this battle's won, you're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. All of you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose.
There has been much talk of a revival of fascism in recent years, and with good reason. Whether the term is uttered in relation to the growing violence, militarisation and power of the police in many nations across the globe. The suspension of liberal democratic rights under myriads of legislation. The growth of online neo-fascist subcultures or street militias, or to the exercise of calculated industrial violence at borders, colonies and reservations, in prisons and in care homes. It is clear that an ill wind is blowing. A growing reaction stands poised to enact unfathomable violence. Here, however, all clarity ends, swept into a whirlpool of confusion. What is driving these forces, or if they may even be called fascist, are questions mired in ambiguity, multitudes of special theories mobilised in pursuit of an answer. Some argue that we are falling into a global police state. Others that particular forces represent something akin to Italy's fasci or Germany's Nazis. Others still that fascism has always been with us, a grisly line of continuity etched in history's sands from the first blood let by Europe's imperial conquerors. Whilst each of these theories may illuminate elements of the reaction which confronts us when in the grasp of an able hand, they fail to offer a full account of the phenomenon. In many respects, this is to be expected. Despite the pages and pages devoted to particularly Nazism's atrocities, there are few clear accounts of historical fascism's fundamental significance. The popular imagination conjures an aberration or a constant, unshakable behemoth. Both approaches belie history.
Sooner or later, in the lives of great nations, comes the moment of decision, comes the moment of destiny. And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talk and of delay, and have decided to follow men and movements who say we go forward to action. Let who dare follow us in this hour. That is the permanent, the mighty mood of Britain. And I claim that in the ranks of our black shirt legions march the mighty ghosts of England's past, and their strong arms around us, and their voices echo down the ages, saying onward.
To this day, one of the clearest articulations of fascism's significance can be found in the work of the British Marxist Rajani Palme Dutt. His seminal work on the question, Fascism and Social Revolution, was published in 1934, shortly after the Nazis had taken power in Germany. Fascism, he argued, is no peculiar, independent doctrine or system arising in opposition to existing capitalist society, but rather the most complete and consistent working out, in certain conditions of extreme decay, of the most typical tendencies and policies of modern capitalism. This formulation, often shortened to fascism is capitalism in decay, is as incisive as it is misunderstood. In modern readings of the text, it produces an explanation counter to Dutt's position, leading to the notion that any crisis or decay of the capitalist mode of production must inevitably give rise to fascism, rather than an attempt to articulate fascism as a suprahistorical phenomenon which must arise from decay, as this suggests. Dutt is demystifying the concrete fascist movements which confronted him. In opposition to these forces' claims to represent a new form of society, he argues that they represented nothing more than a particular organisation of the economic decay which shook capitalism to its core in the first half of the 20th century. As a steadfast anti-imperialist, Dutt allows for other such expressions, arguing that the conquest and exploitation of colonies under British rule represented a British equivalent to fascism. What is useful in this expression is not just that it roots fascism in observable economic developments, not simply dangerous ideas, but also its historical concreteness. This provides us with a powerful tool by which to understand the development of reactionary political forces. Put simply, if fascism in the 20th century represented a particular organisation of decay, then other such organisations are possible. Real economic history must form the root of our approach. In the early 17th century, England was a country in the grips of rapid change, with a long decaying feudal social structure in deepening contradiction with a rising class of merchant and usury capitalists. The origin of these changes can be dated back to the 13th century, or even earlier, with the rise of quasi-global markets propelling the development of powerful merchants. They began to gain a sharp and clear character in England following the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses in 1487 and the Reformation of 1536 to 1540. Representing the last wars between factions of barons for control of the government, the Wars of the Roses saw a significant element of feudal political and economic power crushed in the pursuit of monopoly. The victorious House of Tudor disbanding and disarming its opponents' armies. To maintain the power of a state, however, the crown came increasingly to rely politically on the landed gentry and on the wealthiest merchants as a borrower, Therefore, this process had both crystallised a single feudal nation-state, at that time the largest unified trading area in Europe, and in doing so created the grounds for its dissolution. The Reformation, that is, England's withdrawal from the Catholic Church and the formation of the Church of England under Henry VIII, further developed both of these processes. As an assertion of England's independence, this simultaneously served to transform the clerical classes into a royal civil service and to unleash a vast process of economic transformation by breaking up monastic estates. This both enabled the crown to gain wealth from these estates in the form of tithes and propelled the longest and most extensive market exchange of England's land in history. This dramatically extended the political reach of the merchant capitalists, many rising into the gentry, and of production for the market, a nascent logic of industrial capitalism. This intermingling and confrontation of feudal and capitalist interests, a collision of economic decay and economic boom, formed the aggregate motor contradiction which gave rise to British colonialism. The fundamental factors of the social transformation underway in England, which propelled the initial processes of colonialism, can crudely be summarised as inflation, the exchange and enclosure of land, the need for new commodity markets, and resource depletion. The so-called price revolution, or Great Inflation, saw food treble in price between 1510 and 1580. All prices rise by around 5 times, and wheat rise by 6 times between 1530 and 1640. Driven by a number of factors, the racking of rents, war expenditure, and an expanding population among them, this process of inflation saw the poorer half of English society plunged into deeper poverty, as well as the further depletion of the wealth of the crown. This impoverishment was particularly pronounced among landless workers. As a result of enclosures, that is, the forcible dispossession of the peasantry, and the scale of the land market following the breakup of monastic estates, this section of the population was growing exponentially, reflected in the extent of begging. Whilst a little beyond the establishment of Jamestown chronologically, the circumstances in Sheffield in 1650 are illustrative of the scale of this misery. A full third of the city's population classified as begging poor in official records. Whilst these processes accelerated the capitalist ascension, they also point to increasing need for export markets. The declining wealth of the mass of the population a realisation problem for many goods brought to the market. Finally, a considerable lack of timber and the underdevelopment of coal veins created a fuel shortage, one of the principal arguments for colonising the Americas. And with the onset of bad harvests in the 1590s, food shortages further ramped up prices. One response to these many crises was the formation of joint stock companies, the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company, for the colonisation of the US in 1606. These companies are particularly remarkable for how clearly they capture the emerging social relations. The king chartered them with the hope of raising wealth through taxes and levies. Merchants pooled their capital, financed and ran them with the hope of securing greater profits and access to new markets. Settlers were gathered from the merchant classes, soldiers provided by the state, and labourers recruited from the ranks of the dispossessed peasantry. And so it was. that England shipped its decay to the Americas. On the 28th of June, 1919, a hush descended upon the Hall of Mirrors in Paris's Versailles Palace. With a few flicks of the pen, the Treaty of Versailles went into effect. Germany's colonies were transferred into the hands of its competitors, and its national territory cut apart. Strict limits were placed upon its military, and Germany was made to pay an impossible sum of 226 billion Reichsmarks in gold as reparations. Far from securing a lasting peace, the Versailles Treaty further entrenched the contradictions which had given rise to the First World War. Driven by a declining rate of profit, the imperialist nations had wholly divided the world between them by the early 1900s through a combination of capital exports and colonization. Further expansion impossible without the redivision of the globe, the war was compelled as a necessity of capitalist development. The basis of this competition remained after the war, capital unable to find profitable outlets despite the destruction of around 35% of all humanity's wealth, clearing the ground for reinvestment. This process is very clearly illustrated in the Treaty of Versailles itself, not only in the intended decapitation of German capitalism, but also in the contradictions and struggle between the victorious imperialists over the apportioning of the loot. For example, France's interests lay in seizing the most capital and land it could for its own expansion in order to dominate Europe. In contrast, Britain benefited from continuing to play France and Germany off against each other, and from maintaining its exports to Germany, its largest trading partner, despite the fierce competition between the two. This is reflected in certain compromises. For example, the Rhineland falling under joint Anglo-French management. In short, it was but a pale reflection of peace that haunted Versailles' mirrors as history congregated in its halls. A phantom doomed to shatter.
I was quicker than he was. I tossed his rifle away and I ran my bayonet through his chest. He fell, put his hand on the place where I had hit him, and then I thrust again. Blood came out of his mouth, and he died. I felt physically ill. I nearly vomited. My knees were shaking, and I was, quite frankly, ashamed of myself. My comrades, I was a corporal there then, were absolutely undisturbed by what had happened. One of them boasted that he had killed the Paulie with the butt of his rifle. Another one had strangled the captain, French captain. A third one had hit somebody over the head with his spade. And they were ordinary men like me. One of them was a tram conductor, another one a commercial traveler. Two were students, the rest were farm workers, ordinary people who never would have thought to do any harm to anyone. How did it come about that they were so cruel?
If the war and the Treaty of Versailles failed to resolve the crisis of overaccumulation and imperialist competition which drove the world to war in 1914, they succeeded in leading to the formation of early fascist organisations. The post-war Freikorps are particularly illustrative in this sense. Composed of army veterans and officers, these paramilitaries were formed around principles of nationalism, anti-communism and anti-Semitism. They regarded the treaty as a betrayal of Germany and of her interests. Having first allied with the German Social Democratic Party, or SDP, in the suppression of the November Revolution, these forces aimed to restore the Kaiser and the German Empire by force of arms. This led to frequent clashes between Social Democrats and the paramilitaries with which they had tenuously allied against communism. With the SDP's attempts to disarm 2 Freikorps brigades in 1920, these antagonisms came to a boiling point. On the 13th of March that year, the Freikorps marched on Berlin and forced the Weimar government to flee in an attempted coup known as the Kapp Putsch. They were stopped only by a general strike, masses of workers taking charge of the situation to restore the government. Whilst the paramilitaries were disarmed following the coup's failure, many of their members would go on to play leading roles in the Nazis, founded in February 1920. The line of continuity between the German military in World War I and the Nazis is clear. Further, as Luxemburg proclaimed, the onset of imperialist war had left humanity with a choice: socialism or barbarism. As the conditions which led to the war had not been abolished, this question had yet to receive an answer, leaving the forces of liberalism and social democracy to prevaricate between the communist movement and the reactionaries which make up its clauses.
I remembered then that we were told that the good soldier kills without thinking of his adversary as a human being. The very moment he sees in him a fellow man, he is not a good soldier.
It is a tragic irony that in its initial period, the colony of Jamestown was reliant upon food given to its settlers by the Powhatan Confederacy. Contrary to later developed racist mythologies of noble savages acting out of Edenic naivete, the reasons for this are rooted in the political economy of Powhatan society. A dominant chief ruled, a class of priests beneath him, and the chiefs of local tribes beneath them. Although this rule was secured by force, the ability of the ruling class to alter the lives of the people was very limited, decisions outside of tradition provoking fragmentation. Economically, this society was reliant on a form of agricultural land stewardship and the hunting of deer for subsistence, with a small trade on the principles of a gift economy between tribes. Beyond this, a tributary relationship was the key to the maintenance of the Confederacy. By the time the English arrived, hunters provided a tribute of up to 5 deer to the chief for every one they caught for their tribe, alongside a small annual tribute from a tribe's agricultural production. Tributes were used to sustain armies for the Confederacy by the ruling class. This necessitated expansion, thinning deer populations, pushing hunters east, bringing conflict with other tribes, thus entrenching the need for armies and tribute. However, war was a last resort, the offering of food to other tribes operating as the preferred manner of incorporating others into the Confederacy. The provision of food to the English was such an invitation. Whilst colonial European histories paint this structure as barbaric or primitive. In reality, it represented a sophisticated mode of production, with well-developed agricultural ecology and plant sciences a keystone to maintaining the land. The settlers' response to the food tribute and their later relationship to the land attest to this reality. The deterioration of the fragile peace between the Powhatan and England's settlers into war occurred over a slim number of years. The first sparks came in the first year, in the English response to the Powhatan tribute. Though the English would surely have died without such tribute, resorting to cannibalism a number of times, they responded by asking for a greater amount of food from the Confederacy. When this was not received, they went further, raiding villages. A final attempt to incorporate the English was made after a hunting party encountered John Smith, designated as a leader of the colony by the Virginia Company, and captured him. Smith was married to Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, with the view that this was marrying an English chieftain into the Confederacy. This also failed, though Pocahontas continued to play the role of diplomat between Jamestown and the tribes to which she belonged, until her death in 1617. Relations further deteriorated, and skirmishes became more regular. With an influx of new settlers in 1608 driving an expansion of Jamestown's gradual but persistent incursion on Powhatan land, it was clear a war was brewing. The Confederacy began to take their land back from the colony in 1609, England's presence becoming an intolerable pressure on the already strained tribal economy. Following the death of leading colonists in these skirmishes, the Baron Thomas West took control of Jamestown. He swiftly escalated, demanding the so-called return of the property reclaimed by the indigenous population. Once justly rejected, he went further, sending 70 men to assault the capital of the Paspahegh, the closest Confederacy tribe to Jamestown, on the 9th of August, 1610. This sparked the First Anglo-Powhatan War. A tentative peace was not restored until 1614 under a settlement negotiated by Pocahontas, sealed by her remarriage to the English explorer and early plantation owner John Rolfe. By this point, England's colony had expanded to encompass most of the riverfront of the James River, and two tribes of the Confederacy, the Paspahegh and the Kecowden, were completely annihilated. The sheer brutality of the English toward Virginia's indigenous population in this period was materially driven by two compounding factors: both the need of land for subsistence and the arrival of new settlers requiring expansion. As war circled the James River, this logic was further entrenched by the establishment of the colonial export economy. Attempts to build an economy based around silk or to develop subsistence agriculture prior to the war all failed. Famine's touch lingered until 1611, when John Rolfe successfully cultivated tobacco from the Caribbean. In 1612, he established a plantation, Varina Farms, to grow tobacco for sale in England. This proved profitable, and tobacco grown using slave labour became the central pillar of the Jamestown settlers' economy. This not only promised the arrival of new settlers and further expansion, but also rooted a further logic of economic decay in the forming colonial society. The enormous monocrops produced by this plantation system for the market were ruinous for soil health. Tobacco stripping 10 times the nitrogen and more than 30 times the phosphorus from the soil than monocrops of food. As such, a farmer could only count on 3 to 4 highly profitable tobacco crops from freshly cleared land. After but 5 years of cultivation, the soil would be completely depleted, and new land would be cleared. Though the barren fields were evident to all those involved, tobacco's dominance was ensured by a rapidly expanding market with high prices, and by its durability as one of a handful of crops which could survive the passage to Europe without rot. This dominance was sealed in 1624, when King James I offered a monopoly on the English market to Virginia-grown Caribbean tobacco in exchange for high taxes on every bushel sold. As such, the short-term interests of every element of the class formation at work in the Virginia Company were sated to some degree. The Crown bolstering its income, the capitalists profiting and gaining ownership of Virginia's productive forces, and poorer settlers able to secure land and a living, drifting upward in society's ranks via the market. The violence dealt to the indigenous populations in Virginia found a new motor in the skinning of the earth for lust of profit. Germany's inability to pay the reparations imposed upon it was evident even before the Versailles Treaty was signed. As payments were missed, the inner contradictions of German capitalism and the competitive struggle of imperialist powers in the redivision of its wealth intensified dramatically. While a sequence of conferences over 1921 to 1922 reduced the overall amount of reparations due to a degree, defaults continued. In January 1923, France and Belgium took united action to collect their debts, invading and occupying Germany's Ruhr region, the heartland of its industry, then taking goods as payment. The Liberal Kuno government, formed the year prior, ordered a passive resistance, with a refusal to offer goods or services to the occupying forces, essentially shutting down production, and funded this by money printing. The inflation of the Reichsmark, in motion since 1914, was thus provided a catalyst by the occupation, leading to hyperinflation. In January 1922, a dollar could be exchanged for 191 Reichsmarks. By the November of 1923, it was worth 420 billion Reichsmarks. The price of food skyrocketed, with, for example, the price of a single egg standing at 300 Reichsmarks on the 3rd of February, then jumping to 30,000 Reichsmarks by the 8th of August. The working class were utterly immiserated, gripped by famine and desolation, and the petty bourgeoisie were ruined. The trade unions collapsed. As strikes and clashes with occupying troops spread, it was clear that a revolutionary situation was forming. However, the German Communist Party, which had survived the failure of the 1918 revolution, prevaricated, writing to Moscow for direction. The Russian Political Bureau did not meet to discuss the situation until August, then instructed insurrection. Whether due to the delay or to the broader contradictions of the workers' movement, attempts to rally support among the workers failed. Plans were cancelled, though serious attempts were made at power in October, and the German Communist Party was banned. As the crisis wore on, the Nazis took the initiative. Over 2,000 of its paramilitary wing marching on Munich, intending to secure the city for a siege upon Berlin. Though the attempt, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, failed, with Hitler arrested, it secured the Nazis their first national audience and consolidated their support among the reactionary veterans and officers who made up the party's armed wing. While the crisis of 1923 had shaken German capitalism to its core, material conditions still allowed for a stabilisation under liberal democracy. This was achieved by a combination of factors, most notably the institution of a new currency, the Rentenmark, and the renegotiation of the terms of the Versailles Treaty through the Dawes Plan. As a further expression of the contradictions which had determined the Treaty of Versailles, the new settlement of the Dawes Plan favoured Britain and the US's interests against France, easing reparations payments, agreeing an end to the occupation of the Ruhr realised in 1925, and agreeing a loan of $200 million in credit to Germany from the US. This restarted production across Germany in 1924. It was thus on the basis of credit dependence that German capitalism was able to reconstitute itself through the 1920s. More crucially still, the nature of this reconstitution served to further elevate the contradictions of overaccumulation developed in the lead-up to the World Wars. Termed rationalization, the process of economic development undertaken over this period revolved around making efficiencies by moving from ad hoc workflows to sets of published rules. A growth of monopolies and cartels, and the use of machinery to replace labour. In consequence, fixed capital costs, that is, costs which remain in place if production is in motion or not, rose rapidly. This compelled industry to continue or expand production, even if the goods it produced could find no market, as this would result in a less severe loss than shutting down production. Germany's Steel Trust, founded in 1926, illustrates this clearly. This amalgamation of firms resulted not only in a reorganisation around the flow of production, but also the further linking together of the individual units of production. One example being the linking together of a factory in such a way that blast furnace gases performed the role of fuel. Whilst this created massive fuel and labour efficiencies, it meant that no one part of the plant could work without any other, and saw fixed capital costs increase inordinately. In essence, therefore, the debt-fueled rationalisation undertaken in the 1920s represented the realisation of Marx's understanding that capital's tendency toward monopoly brings it into contradiction with the free market. The external compulsion towards ceaseless production generated by fixed capital and the tendency toward planning developed by monopoly, necessitating a planned economy as a whole. These contradictions would prove to be crucial for fascism. However, whilst this stabilisation lasted, they eroded its basis, the Nazis virtually disappearing from public concern as coalitions of liberals and social democrats ruled over the fading Weimar Republic.
Unsere Erwerbslosen standen jeden Freitag in Riesenschlangen vor dem Arbeitsamt und bekamen am Schalter 5 Mark. Nicht, das ist eine völlig neue und andere Situation. Da waren viele bei, die hatten ganz einfach nicht die Mittel, um ihr Essen zu kaufen.
Aber sonst war das sagen wir mal, ein trostloses Schien mit den Menschen, die mit Löffel in der Tasche spazieren gegangen sind, weil sie zum Mittagessen bekamen sie ein Essen mit einer Marke. Das war ja unmöglich.
Ich habe habe solche Demonstrationen gesehen, aber
I saw some of these demonstrations,
Plakate, die da
but I can't tell you anymore what sort of placards they were carrying or specifically how it was organized.
dass sie
All I can remember is that they were shouting the word hunger.
wirklich Leute da waren.
And they were really large rallies, so we sometimes wondered if our route to school was going to be blocked. These weren't just small groups, they were really large rallies.
Es waren also nicht nur kleine Gruppen, sondern es waren richtig große Aufmärsche.
In September 1923, shares on the London Stock Exchange collapsed. This was followed, in October, by the collapse of the market on Wall Street, inaugurating the Great Depression. The scale of the crash was immediately evident, the Dow losing 11% of its value on the 24th of October, 12.8% on the 28th of October, and 11.73% on the 29th of October. Whilst this initial fall reached its bottom in November, hopes of a stabilisation did not last long. In April 1931, the Austrian bank of the Rothschild concern collapsed. Not only did this again send global markets into freefall, it set off the implosion of the global credit system. The bank had been a central pillar of the Central and Eastern European financial system based on credit. Accordingly, panicked American investors withdrew all of their short-term investments from the region. For a Germany fueled by debt, this proved disastrous. In just a few weeks, the Reichsbank lost 3 million marks in gold and foreign currencies. Though the US placed a moratorium on German reparations payments in June, the crash was already underway. The collapse of the German Wool Trust saw the Donat Bank, one of the 5 largest banks in Germany and the financial power behind heavy industry, and particularly the Steel Trust, lose over 100% of its capital. On the 1st of August, a further moratorium on all German short-term debt went into place, freezing the money market operated by Germany and other European nations. This culminated on the 21st of September, when the English pound came off the gold standard, bringing the whole international credit system to a standstill. From then until the start of the Second World War, only one transfer of credit took place, and even indispensable trade had to be negotiated on the basis of barter. International finance capitalism had collapsed entirely. For debtor nations, like Germany, this had the effect of limiting trade to their home territory. The social consequences of this were catastrophic, with, for example, 1 in 3 Germans unemployed by 1933. It was only once German capitalism had fallen wholly into this gaping pit that the various contradictions of its decay could cohere to allow the rise of the fascist state. Prior to the Great Depression, the class composition of the Nazi Party was limited to the embittered counter-revolutionary military culture from which it had emerged, and sections of the petty bourgeoisie facing proletarianization, their savings wiped out in the hyperinflation of 1923. Over 1931 to 1932, this composition underwent dramatic change with the formation of a new power cluster around Hitler. The first clear political expression of this process came in the form of a meeting of the so-called National Opposition at the Harzburg Spa on the 11th of October 1931. This brought the Nazis and other petty bourgeois political forces into an alliance with a considerable faction of Germany's monopolists. For example, the main financiers and general manager of the Steel Trust, and the director of the Coal Syndicate. To fully grasp these developments, it must be understood that these forces represented one side of a split in German monopoly capital, the other allied around the conservative Brüning government which had taken power in 1930. The essential question at hand in this split lay in a struggle over different policies of imperialist expansion, those allied around Brüning in favour of a conciliatory policy in relation to the victors of the First World War, and the Habsburg Front, as they came to be known, favouring a confrontation. The material basis for this divergence is found in the competitive positions of Germany's various monopolies. Siemens is typical of those in the Brüning camp. Reliant upon the world market, and particularly upon infrastructure contracts in the oppressed world, as well as credit, the firm's economic interests lay in maintaining its participation in the global economy on favourable terms with its financiers and those likely to dominate infrastructure investments. As with the majority of the industries in the Brüning camp, the sheer scale of the company allowed it to maintain this strategy even in the face of deep decay. In contrast, those monopolists in the Habsburg Front were now in a subordinate competitive position, and following the rationalisation of the 1920s, incapable of operating within the logics of the market. Only rearmament could provide the drive to allow their plants to function without cessation, and for them to reassert themselves as viable competitors. This required both war and dictatorship. Each side of this split also found an alliance with a section of the German agricultural classes. The Habsburg Front allied with large aristocratic landowners, remnants of German feudalism that the failed bourgeois revolution of 1848 had been incapable of dislodging. The Brüning camp sided with small farmers. From this polarisation, the final stages of the Nazi ascendancy were set in motion. As the Great Depression developed, the Brüning camp's position became untenable. The relationship between agricultural imports, the consumption of agricultural classes, and industrial production provides a clear example of the irreconcilable nature of the contradictions faced. Germany suffered the largest export losses of any country on the world market during the Depression. This forced its agricultural sector into protectionism. Accordingly, attempts to negotiate declines in agricultural imports with trading partners without seeing a decline in industrial exports proved impossible. To end agricultural protectionism would have meant a loss of at least 11 million marks in farm mortgages, the cornerstone of the savings bank and insurance industry, as well as the further erosion of national markets for industrial production. These contradictions, and many others, provided an economic compulsion toward dictatorship. For example, for German industry to lower prices to compete on the world market and remain able to turn a profit required a considerable lowering of wages. The strength and militancy of the German workers' movement in the face of rapidly deteriorating conditions prevented this, confining the government to negotiations. The limits of liberalism had been reached. As the support of the Brüning camp broke away, the industrial monopolists and the large-scale landowners of the Habsburg Front concluded negotiations over what would prove to be a central policy in the formation of a new bourgeois unity. Agrarian Catalyzation. This would allow industry to set the output of small farmers and enforce this through the largest landowners, who would receive a monopoly over Germany's trade in grains and potatoes in kind. Small farmers would be guaranteed a market by the state setting prices, something which would also capture the European market by providing more advantageous prices than even those available in England. Whilst still riven with contradictions, this agreement provided a means by which the contradictions between agriculture and industry could be turned into a tool of imperialist expansion. The allure of this proposition in the face of the Great Depression served to draw Germany's monopolists and army together under one banner, that of Habsburg and dictatorship. Indeed, even the staunchest supporters of the Brüning camp, for example I.G. Farben, had come under its sway by the conclusion of 1932. The preconditions for dictatorship were realised in this new unity forged by the Habsburg front, with fascism serving as its political basis. And so, on the 30th of January 1933, Hitler came to power. The Nazi terror had begun. We may now draw some provisional conclusions from our examination thus far of the economic basis of fascism in Germany and the initial motions of English settler colonialism in the Americas. Firstly, it is clear that Dutt was correct in his assessment that fascism was an expression and an organisation of capitalist decay. This is evident from the initial class basis of the Nazi Party in an embittered petty bourgeoisie, the virtual disappearance of the party during the relative stability of 1924 to 1929, and in the new bourgeois unity formed around fascist dictatorship in 1933, all other options for capital having evaporated. Arguments which situate the motor forces of fascism at the point of ideology cannot account for this, nor can those which attempt to argue that fascism is distinct from capitalism. Secondly, it is clear that the form of economic decay which drove German fascism was inseparable from the composition of imperialist capital following the First World War and the particular contradictions that this gave rise to. Though this may sound like a somewhat banal observation, it provides a clear refutation to arguments which present fascism as a supra-historical process, present in all periods of capitalist history. A typical presentation of this type of argument looks at the genocidal violence exercised by the European empires in the processes of colonization, and then, owing to similarities between colonial white supremacy and fascism's modern articulation of racial supremacy, draws a line causally connecting the two. Whilst it is certainly true that fascism took inspiration from the European genocides in the colonies, the American and British eugenics movements, or the racial quote-unquote science used to justify these processes. To treat the phenomena as a political identity or a direct continuity of the same process is to treat both in a fundamentally unserious way. As we have seen, the economic basis of settler colonialism and fascism differ enormously. To erase this difference erases both their concrete motion and their significance as distinct organisations of distinct forms of concrete economic decay. This erasure is clearly realised in attempts to describe fascism as a form of primitive accumulation. That is, the economic process by which accumulated wealth was first transformed into industrial capital. simply by reference to the fact that both fascism and settler colonialism involved racialized violence in their processes of accumulation. Though Dutt's understanding that fascism represented an organisation of capitalist decay fundamentally driven by crisis is correct, it must be said that his understanding of the form of this organisation is flawed. In particular, his view of fascism as a dictatorship of monopoly capital offers only a partial articulation of its class character. As we have seen, fascism did not possess a basis in monopoly capital until considerably late in its development, and as we shall see, even then fleetingly. This problem is born out of Dutt's total dismissal of fascism's claims to have created a type of state distinct from that seen prior to its emergence, the corporate state. This is unfortunate, yet he can hardly be blamed for it. The historical information necessary to fully grasp these questions had yet to happen, or was available only to a small group of people. Indeed, were it not for the publication of Alfred Sohn-Rethel's book, The Economic and Class Structure of German Fascism, in 1978, then this information may never have seen the light of day, including that which we have discussed surrounding the split in German monopoly capital. As a young Marxist, sohn-rethel worked as an assistant to the MWT, a key institute of German monopoly capital, from which the Habsburg Front operated, and the setting in which the policy of Agrarian Catalyzation was negotiated. Operating clandestinely, he was able to keep a close record of the relationship between Germany's monopolists and the Nazi Party. His work thus provides an unparalleled insight into fascism's class character, political economy, and state. Combined with Dutt, sohn-rethel's work allows us to provide a real definition of fascism as a political form. Fascism's nature as an organisation of economic decay can be crudely illustrated by a brief examination of the economic position of the workers under Nazi rule and the relationship between monopoly capital and the state. This first element is relatively straightforward. Through the exercise of naked dictatorship, justified under a haze of propaganda following the Reichstag fire on the 27th of February 1933, the Communist Party was banned and unions dissolved. Social democracy, which had performed the role of securing a mass base for capitalism, negotiating for short-term interests of sections of the German working class, but siding with the forces of reaction against communism, was also smashed. The collective bargaining power of the working class was shattered entirely, allowing a drastic increase in the rate of exploitation of labour, the sole source of value and thus profit in a capitalist economy. This was achieved by a considerable reduction of wages and a considerable increase in the number of workers employed and hours worked on the basis of these reduced wages, or through compulsory labour service and work camps. By 1936, the total wages paid out to the German working class was the same as in the slump of 1932. But the total number employed had risen from 12.5 million people to 17 million people, representing, for example, an increase of 84% in the total hours worked in industry. That this required total dictatorship provides a lens into the second element of our sketch. That is, the relation of the monopoly bourgeoisie to the fascist state. As we said, the Social Democratic Party had acted as a point of class collaboration and compromise in the Weimar Republic, securing capitalism a mass base by negotiating for the short-term interests of key sections of the workers. Its banning, therefore, served to remove any working-class share of power. As Sohn-Rethel argues, this brings the bourgeoisie into a constant polemic with its own unavoidable situation, that of fascist dictatorship. This dictatorship is by no means simply a tool of bourgeois rule for the suppression of the workers, but will perform this role only if it is able to ride roughshod over the bourgeoisie too, forcing it to go the way they want. This was achieved by the Enabling Act of March 1933, which formalised the transition to dictatorship, then consummated in the Nazi purges of June and July 1934, and Hitler's appointment of himself as Führer that August. Economically, this bestowed the state power over the entrepreneurial and managerial functions of capital, the dictatorship determining what is produced, how, import and export quotas, wage levels, credit distribution, and so on, whilst leaving profit and capital itself private. This allowed the state to construct the planned economy necessitated by the needs of fixed capital in Germany, but upon a private basis, something clearly evident in the programme of Agrarian Catalyzation and the 4-year plans of rearmament which built the Nazi war economy. Though this often contradicted the interests of many sections of the monopoly bourgeoisie, they were unable to summon any opposition to this process. This is not simply a matter of force. For example, the German army could have been mobilised to smash fascism at a word early in the dictatorship, but rather results from the insolubility of the contradictions faced by German capitalism, the necessity of dictatorship for accumulation. From this, we may offer a clear summary on the nature of fascism as an organisation of decay. On the one hand, it represented an absolute and terroristic dictatorship over the masses. On the other, it represented a dictatorship of the fascist state over capital. Fascism is a dictatorship of and over monopoly capital.
Diese Revolution macht nirgends Halt. Sie hat das politische Leben umgestellt und eine Reform der deutschen Nation an Haupt und Gliedern vorgenommen. Adolf Hitler ist der Träger dieser Bewegung. Die Zeit, die wir durchleben, ist von historischem Rang. Wir durchschreiten in Deutschland eine Umwälzung von unabsehbaren Ausmaßen. Die Revolution hat sich siegreich durchgesetzt.
To grasp the economic character of early settler colonialism, we must turn to examine the crystallization of its relations in the plantation system. As is well known, these enterprises were run upon the basis of slave labour from the African continent and the indigenous populations of the Americas, this second source of indentured labour further developing the vicious expansion of the colonies seen in Virginia. Chattel slavery, that is, slavery in which the slave is a commodity, purchased on the market and owned by the buyer, was established before the establishment of Jamestown. The first English trade in African slaves beginning in 1563. It formed an integral part of the settler colonial economy from the start, the market in enslaved Africans and the America's indigenous peoples, supplementing the work of indentured labourers from England. The expansion of the colonies drove its further expansion. The centrality of slave labour to the settler colonial economy can be illustrated easily. By 1710, African slaves made up 42% of the entire population of Virginia. For our present purposes, however, the scale of chattel slavery is secondary to its economic character. It is an axiom of much vulgar Marxism that the exploitation of slave labour is incompatible with the economic form of industrial capital, an analysis drawn from the manner in which Marx presents the established logics of waged labour in the first volume of Capital. As the Marxist historian Jairus Banerjee argues in his seminal essay, Modes of Production in a Materialist Conception of History, this fundamentally misunderstands Marx's view of industrial capitalism, reducing the character of production to the form of labour exploitation it deploys. In every other element, the plantation is an enterprise of industrial capital. Monocrops of tobacco, later cotton, coffee, and so on, were produced not for subsistence or for the consumption of a feudal baron, but for sale on the market at a profit. Plantations were owned by capitalist investors, and labour had to be purchased by further capital. This is exactly the logic which underpins Marx's understanding of industrial capital, which he defines as the production of surplus value. The plantation emerges as a capitalist enterprise, and chattel slavery as a distinct capitalist form of slave labour in which the slave figures as fixed capital, that is, as an instrument of production. In the grand arc of history, the establishment of the plantation system represents one process of the primitive accumulation of industrial capital, establishing the logics of surplus value production as formally dominant in the Americas. As Marx says, capitalism was born of blood and fire.
Masa baby won't kill me, oh. Masa baby won't kill me, oh. Masa baby won't kill me, oh. For he killed me, he shipped me regular.
Tell you the truth, when I think of it today, I don't know how I'm living. Been slaves all our lives, and mother was a slave, sister was a slave, father was a slave.
They know nothing about reading right. All that I know, the teachers of mine, your master and your missus.
The army told the chiefs, you come here and sign this paper, we're going to educate your kids, they're going to learn, you know, it's like we were pagans, we were savages. And they said, no, you have to learn society. You have to learn to be civil. If they didn't, they were hung.
I did 2 boarding schools, one in Wapton Indian School in Wapton, North Dakota, and the other one is Flandreau Indian School in Flandreau, South Dakota. They took me away from all of that and punished me for talking that. It was my first language, I didn't know any other language. So whenever I talk, it came out. Cree would come out, and whenever I talk, I get hit. I got hit so much I lost my tongue. I lost my native tongue. The only thing I remember was my Indian name.
Other people didn't have no beds when they were slaves. They all slept on the floor. Pallet here, pallet there. Just like a lot of wild people. We didn't know nothing. Didn't like to look at no book.
Well, they taken that old woman, poor old woman, carried in the peach orchard and whipped her. And, just tied her hand this way, around the peach orchard tree. I remember that just as well, looked like to me, I can, and round the tree and whipped her. And well, she couldn't do nothing but just kick her feet, just kick her feet.
Well, that's the real Holocaust. Very comparable to the, what the Nazis did to the Jews in recent times, if not even more severe.
But you're talking from 80 million to 10 million.
That's right.
Sohn-rethel argues that the fascist economic system represented the transformation of a productive economy into a destructive one. This is nowhere clearer than in the economic basis of the Holocaust, or Shoah. That is, the transformation of the work camp into the death camp. In this process, every contradiction of the economic decay underpinning fascist rule was crystallized. As we have said, the fascist dictatorship made considerable use of forced labour service and work camps in its efforts to meet the needs of a capitalism sagging under the weight of its fixed capital costs. This began all but immediately after the Nazi seizure of power, the first concentration camps established in the winter of 1933, forced labour beginning within them in 1934, and compulsory labour service for all men between 18 and 25, starting in 1935. In 1937, the Third Reich expanded both forced labour service and the concentration camp system considerably in response to labour shortages. This state-directed slavery allowed fascism to meet the needs of the planned economy without extending wages. However, this process also further elevated the contradictions which had given it motion. As we have said, the slave features as fixed capital under a capitalist economy, situated as an instrument of production which requires upkeep. The incorporation of slaves into many of the labour processes of German capitalism, therefore, further increased fixed capital costs across the whole economy. Whilst these costs were centralised under the state, they were still unsustainable, even given the threadbare existence of life in the camps. Accordingly, fixed capital was lowered by the construction of an economy of death. Execution by bullet or gas chamber, themselves providing a market for monopoly capitalists like IG Farben, producers of the sarin gas, thus came to function as a counter-tendency to this contradiction. By 1942, this process had reached the scale of industrial genocide, with mass gassings becoming a fixture of the camp system. This was complemented by a process of annihilation through work. Prisoners literally worked to death. So extreme was this cycle of slavery and death that any damage caused to another element of fixed capital, machinery, etc., was met by summary execution. For example, disabled people enslaved in a factory sewing uniforms would be executed if they broke more than 5 needles over the entire course of their enslavement. We must be clear that this is not to explain the Holocaust in its totality, for this is impossible in the absence of the history of the oppressed peoples it targeted and the nature of their oppression, particularly anti-Semitism. but to illustrate that it grew upon the basis of the contradictions of a decaying capitalist system. The 16 to 17 million Jewish, disabled, Slavic, Roma and LGBT people lost to the Nazi inferno were, in the final analysis, lost to contradictions both natural and particular to industrial capitalism in its monopoly phase. The Holocaust was a modern, capitalist, imperialist genocide.
As I went in, there was a young, I think she was a young girl, I don't know, and I was talking to her, then we went inside, then I saw a number of bodies on the ground, and I said, why are they sleeping there, going to the huts? She looked at me as if I was mad. She said, they're dead. That's the first time I saw a group of dead people. And then she took me forward. Then I saw nearly as high as this ceiling, about 24,000 bodies, all dead. And then I spoke to a number of women. One lady was with her back to me, and all the others went like this, as if indicating that she was semi-mad. Then I learned the terrible story. Her child was thrown up into the air. And shot. They tried to find out how many bullets went into the kid's body.
Where was your family?
My family was in Prussia too.
They were, so you guys were together?
Oh, well, not together. In the camp, everyone was in a separate place in a different barrack, because you were sleeping in the barracks according to the place you were working.
What was going through your mind at the time?
What was going through my mind? I had no mind at all. I was worried next morning what's going to happen. So that camp was so terrible because there was selection. There was selection. So you stand up in the morning on the P-Platz, and first of all they were counting every day. But one day they come up undressed, and a lot of people who were not fit today were sending away to die.
I was afraid then, for the first time. You know why? There were flames until the sky, and a strange smell. The smell I remember from home when my mother burns on Friday a chicken.
The second day I asked, when am I going to reunite with my mother? And they took me in the arm and showed me the chimney, and they said, when you go out the same way.
We were next to the gas chamber and crematoria, and we learned how to sleep. You smelled the blood all night, and we learned how to sleep.
I always feel guilty. I said, why me? Why me?
We took an oath there as I was burying the people. I said, never again, never, never again.
What we have discussed here is not truly a history, neither of early English settler colonialism nor German fascism. In both instances, what we have outlined pertains only to the fundamental economic laws of motion and significance of these forms. This limitation is particularly felt with regard to settler colonialism. Here, it is necessary to say that our account represents but an infinitesimal fragment of the apocalypse wrought upon the peoples of the Americas and the African continent. All we have established is that the economic basis of these processes proceeds from a form of economic decay quite distinct from that which led to fascism, and that chattel slavery played a fundamental role in the establishment of industrial capitalism. The many genocides and struggles of settler colonialism, which subsists to this day and the impact of this process in the colonialist nations are the subject of a future work. In contrast, our handling of fascism has allowed us to form a clear definition of the form as a dictatorship of and over monopoly capitalism, applicable not only to the classical example of Nazi Germany, but to the other fascist nations of the 20th century. This poses a challenging question with regard to traditional Marxist approaches to fascism's class basis. Trotskyists holding the position that it represents a petty bourgeois politic, and Leninists that it is a politic of monopoly capitalism. Neither position holds when faced with the scrutiny of materialist history, though the latter is clearly closer to the mark. Fascism possesses a restless and relentless energy, moving through the social strata of monopoly capitalist society in decay, like a tidal wave. Where it begins among a petty bourgeoisie facing proletarianization and reactionary military men, it soon sheds this class basis as the centre of its gravity, coursing through the gilded halls of monopoly capital's erudite and cruel masters, then, with the force of a whirlpool, sucking them too beneath the surf. The force of this endeavour is not found in any unique class, but precisely in the mounting rot of the system as a whole. It is therefore impossible without the fascist party, which serves as the vanguard of capitalism's contradictions, the vanguard of decay. Through its vicious suppression of the working class, it attempts to reconstitute capitalist relations. As our examination of the Holocaust illustrates, even by the institution of slavery, this proves impossible. For the burden of fixed capital may only be resolved by destruction. And so, this is fascism's highest achievement. Where the German Revolution of 1918 succeeded in pursuing Lenin's strategy of converting the imperialist world war into a civil war, fascism succeeded in converting this civil war back into an imperialist war. Its so-called revolution leads nowhere but back to the mud.
Since the start of the year, prices have surged a chilling 670%.
Fundamentally, there's a mismatch between supply and demand. With the end of the pandemic, we're returning to normal, and there's more people wanting to use gas than are currently able to supply it.
Natural gas is the key raw material for making fertilizers like ammonia, urea and nitrates, but prices have already almost doubled in the space of a single year. And now, due to the soaring price of gas, a third of Europe's fertilizer factories have stalled production.
Electricity prices are up over 900% in countries like Germany year over year, as demand surges while supply continues to decrease.
To grasp the nature of the reactionary waves today sweeping our world, it is necessary to begin with the economic decay which forms their basis and motor. The broad contradictions of this process: world historic levels of money hoarding and debt, near zero interest rates, exhausted currencies, all point to the fulfillment of Marx's analysis that capitalist accumulation tends toward a zero rate of profit, and thus a final breakdown. As illustrated by the environmental crisis, it is not hyperbole when we say that the choice facing us is no longer between socialism or barbarism, but socialism or extinction. One expression of this process can be seen in the energy crisis, which began over the course of 2021, with, for example, natural gas costs rising by over 570% in Europe and over 600% in Asia over the course of the year. The causes of this lie partially in a decline in production over lockdowns, partially in lower than expected outputs from solar and wind, and partially in the planned obsolescence of certain fossil fuel and nuclear infrastructure. This has revealed and heightened staggering contradictions in the global economy. Prices for many raw materials have skyrocketed, and this has further fueled the general inflation seen through 2021, with inflation rates in the US, the EU and Britain reaching levels not seen since the crisis of the 1970s by December. The run-on impact upon food production is marked, with natural gas accounting for up to 80% of the productive inputs of some fertilizers. Their prices have risen across the board by between 100 and over 200%. The impact on food prices globally will be unbearable. Even the production of fossil fuels themselves have been hit by the crisis, with refineries in Europe, Asia and America slowing production. This is due to an increasing reliance upon unconventional fossil fuels, which require greater energy inputs to refine. 15.5% of energy produced from oil already used for this purpose, a figure expected to increase to 50% by 2050. The catalyst given to imperialism's structural crises by the pandemic has set in motion an unstoppable collapse, each crisis in production leading to another. This points to both the integrated nature of the global economy and the necessity of worldwide planning, both factors with echoes of the economic position of German capital in the 1930s. Whilst many strands of contemporary analysis accept this picture as proof of an already existing or potential global turn to fascism, particularly notions of a global police state, this belies reality. A materialist approach must necessarily translate these contradictions into national contexts to make any such assessment.
Johnson, while you have 5 minutes, you're live on Good Morning Britain. Could you talk to Piers and Susanna for me?
I'll be with you in a second.
Yeah, I have an earpiece here in my hands, ready to go. Right, he's been taken inside, into the freezer.
He's gone into the fridge.
There's a bunker.
It's very heroic work,
had so far, isn't it?
That was heroic work. What was the minder saying to you?
Closed.
It is time for real change, and I can't wait for December the 12th.
I want everyone to go about their Christmas preparations happy and secure in the knowledge that here, in this people's government, the work is now being stepped up to make 2020 a year of prosperity and growth and hope, and to deliver a parliament that works for the people.
In the 7th week of the lockdown, the United Kingdom has now recorded Europe's highest number of deaths linked to coronavirus.
We had a truly horrific statistic that almost 60% of the deaths had been amongst disabled people. How did you feel when you heard that news?
Helpless and angry.
I want a world in which we send you Marmite, you send us Vegemite, we send you penguins, and you send us, with reduced tariffs, these wonderful Arnott's Tim Tams. How long can the British people be deprived of the opportunity to have Arnott's Tim Tams at a reasonable price?
But we now know that on the night of the 16th of April, as the Queen prepared for Prince Philip's funeral, some Downing Street staff brought a suitcase of wine into the building for leaving parties that included music and dancing.
Yeah, I'm a coke addict. Total coke addict.
It was not a premeditated, organised party in that sense that the Prime Minister himself decided to have sent out. Well, he, as far as I can see, he was, in a sense, ambushed with a cake.
Whether they were deliberate lies or not has yet to be established, but he's clearly said things to the House that were not true.
The Prime Minister tells the truth.
Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I've reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Britain is the oldest and most parasitic imperialist nation in the world. Its economy entirely reliant upon the export of usury capital and thus production outside of its borders. Prior to the pandemic, this position was already proving unsustainable. Competitive tensions between the US and the EU imperialist bloc, cutting the British bourgeoisie into two camps. The pro-EU section of the bourgeoisie relied on cheap access to foreign markets and even cheaper access to foreign labour to offset the effects of the profitability crisis of the 2000s. Their Eurosceptic opponents, disproportionately small business people and fringe sections of finance capital, feared wipeout or economic castration in the open competition of the single market. Ideologically, this took the form of concerns for British sovereignty, that is, the right to erect barriers to stifle their competition at home, or the protection of old partnerships with former colonies or industrial powerhouses, a desperate hunt for viable markets. The victory of the Johnson government in the 2019 election and the consummation of the Brexit referendum on the 31st of January 2020 initially appeared to have allowed for the reunion of these two hostile camps. This has proven illusory. With GDP growth flat even in January 2020, the pandemic necessitating an enormous rise in state spending to subsidise the losses of private capital, encroaching inflation and disruption to supply chains. The crisis facing British imperialism was only deepened, and the splits within its bourgeoisie reorganised along new lines. One of the clearest splits can be seen in divergences over pandemic management strategies. A libertarian faction of the Conservative Party, organised through the Coronavirus Research Group, representing the interests of petty bourgeois capitalists faced with proletarianisation in the wake of lockdown, pitted against those favouring lockdowns, who represent the interests of monopoly capitalists able to weather the storm. Whilst this uneasy coalition was able to sustain itself for a period through rampant corruption and Johnson's electability, the slew of scandals under his leadership have made the present formation untenable. Whilst the bourgeois unity through the Conservative Party will be maintained under a new leader following Johnson's inevitable demise, it will be riven by the same contradictions in a context of escalating social unrest, particularly should an inordinate rise in the cost of living, including a 50% increase in fuel prices, come to pass in April. The fragility of these circumstances has produced an avalanche of reactionary legislation aimed at solidifying the government's political control over Parliament and repressing social movements, as well as deepening processes of repugnant violence against migrants, women, and disabled or racially oppressed people. It is these processes, alongside the all but complete collapse of social democratic representation in Britain, which have led to a widespread charge of fascism against the British government.
The scenes, Mr. Speaker, in Bristol yesterday were utterly shameful. We saw criminal thuggery and disorder caused by a minority who put lives at risk.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom! It is our duty to fight for our freedom! It is our duty to win! It is our duty to win! Shame on you!
The Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill stands at the centre of many such accusations. The bill intended to introduce police provisions to issue blanket bans on protests, sentences of up to 10 years for involvement in them, and bans on named individuals from attending demonstrations at all, with even more severe sentences should such bans be breached. In response, this produced a lively resistance movement focused on the defence of the right to protest following the murder of Sarah Everard by Officer Wayne Couzens of the Metropolitan Police, and the subsequent violence of his comrades in the Met to women at a vigil in her memory. Having survived a blitz of propaganda and the shock and awe tactics deployed against it by the police, this movement has achieved a considerable victory. Provisions to allow the banning of demonstrations removed from the bill in its third reading in the House of Lords on the 16th of January 2022. Were the suppression of political movements itself definitional of fascism, this example alone would suffice to illustrate that, whilst a reactionary push is in motion, liberalism is still limping on in Britain. However, as we have seen, fascism is not simply a dictatorship over the masses, but also a suspension of bourgeois democracy. The fascist state directing the activity of monopoly capital. Whilst the Johnson government has been attempting to pass a great number of measures to seal conservative rule over Westminster, for example, an ability for MPs to ignore courts, voter ID, a form of voter suppression, and an electoral oversight committee run by the ruling party, none of these measures represent a break with liberalism, nor a dictatorship over monopoly capital, which still definitively rules over Parliament through its lobbies and raw economic power. Rather, this process is the result of a failing bourgeois unity, desperately clinging to power. It represents the hardening of the ordinary dictatorial functions of the capitalist state and a weighting of Parliament in the favour of this bourgeois unity. It is driven by the insoluble dilemma faced by British capitalism. Whilst the contradictions which might give rise to a fascist state in Britain are certainly present in the motion of British capital, the decisive factors, the fascist party, its victory in unifying the bourgeoisie, and its subsequent establishment of a dictatorship over their heads, are still absent. What confronts Britain in the immediate future is not fascism, but a liberal authoritarianism. Views to the contrary, premised on the naked violence of this process or its flagrantly anti-democratic content, are, we must insist, simply naive to the depravity of liberalism and the capitalist system as a whole.
Everyone was ordered out of the area, and the battle went on sporadically.
On the 20th of January 2022, it was revealed that the British Army is in the process of constructing camps for migrants. 2 days later, the Home Office announced that any male migrant arriving in Britain by sea will face detention. This naked persecution represents the further development of Britain's venomous immigration laws, which under Theresa May's stint as Home Secretary were already explicitly aimed at creating a hostile environment for migrants. A requirement that paperwork be produced for access to housing, healthcare, driver's licenses, and many other necessities, effectively producing a segregation of immigrants. Driven by the competitive needs of the petty bourgeoisie, lucrative contracts for security firms in the management of borders and immigration prisons, and the waves of migration generated by imperialist wars of conquest in the Middle East, and particularly Syria, or soon to be generated by the environmental crisis. This escalating violence is by no means unique to Britain. The role of Frontex in the horrific repression of migrants across the EU's borders for profit, or the role of G4S and Serco in operating Australia's island immigration prisons make this clear. Nor is Britain's turn toward the use of the army in managing these contradictions a unique escalation in this respect. Rather, it represents a further realization of the processes of global imperialist breakdown. To grasp this, we first need to understand that this breakdown is producing the conditions for a third imperialist world war. The world wholly divided between blocks of imperialist capital and tensions rising in kind. As a consequence of both the interwoven nature of global imperialist capital and the complexity of modern militaries, this has produced a new doctrine of warfare, which seeks to utilize every element of human society as a weapon of war, known as hybrid warfare. Whilst ostensibly a rationalization of a collapsing security environment, the role that this doctrine plays in relation to migration is already clear. Migrants themselves are today considered weapons, their conscious direction or repelling as acts of war. This ghastly, inhuman view has already been put into practice in conflicts between Greece and Turkey over territories in the Mediterranean, resulting in Greece drowning over 1,000 migrants at sea, or in border clashes between Poland and Belarus. Viewed in totality, this represents a qualitatively new organisation of capitalist decay. The transformation of productive to destructive economic relations realised in the transformation of workers' surplus to capital accumulation's requirements into instruments of war. As we have said, fascism is not the only possible organisation of capitalist decay.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above.
Madam Vice President, my fellow Americans, to state the obvious, 1 year ago today, in this sacred place, democracy was attacked. Simply attacked.
If we have shown that the decay confronting us does not axiomatically result in the formation of fascist dictatorship, then it remains for us to illustrate the political consequences of claims falsely evoking that such a dictatorship has already been attained. With this in mind, we return to that land with which we began our sketch. Throughout Trump's presidency, it was a popular position to refer to his administration as fascist, a charge often backed by reference to the horrific violence of the US border, his misogyny, his naked racism, or his rampant corruption. Though we are clear that Trump himself was a fascist, and his presidency cultivated a slew of reactionary policies, the United States clearly did not abolish bourgeois democracy under his rule. The reasons for this inability to, as sohn-rethel says, ride roughshod over the bourgeoisie are starkly revealed in the failed insurrection of the 6th of January 2021. Though Trump was able to unleash fascism's traditional blend of petty bourgeois and competitively disadvantaged monopoly capitalists on the US Capitol building with a blustering wind of rhetoric. This produced little but a strange form of tourism. Insurrectionists wandering the halls of power with no idea what to do. With a considerable wing of the Republican Party forming around Biden and the preservation of bourgeois democracy, Trump had no choice but to leave the White House. The absence of a fascist party organised to take power scuppered the attempt. In this context, preemptive charges of fascism not only served to obscure the weakness of both Trump and the broader US bourgeoisie's position, but also to rally support for a liberal Biden government. His campaign relying on a hidden alliance with NGO activists under the rubric of a united front, and the massive calls from opportunists on the left to vote blue, justified under the siren song of fighting fascism. Since assuming office, Biden has deported more people than Trump did in his entire presidency, expanded the system of camps so derided under the former president, and continued the trajectory set by Trump in drawing the world ever closer to global war. This has been met by a broad silence. Whilst an account of the future direction of the US is beyond the scope of this film, it is clear that Biden is pleasing no one with his own flavour of liberal authoritarianism. Whether a future resolution will take the form of a continuation of a crisis-ridden bourgeois democracy, the institution of a fascist dictatorship via the emergence of a fascist vanguard among the US's militias, or the fascisation of the Republican Party, or a dwindling into social collapse, is impossible to say. As Trump was so fond of saying, all options are on the table.
Thank you.
That's a great asset. More inflation. What a stupid son of a...
In his reflections on the French coup d'etat of 1851 and the establishment of dictatorship under Napoleon, Marx wrote that Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. Nowhere else have Marx's words been so abused in quotation. His meaning here is not simply that history repeats itself in increasingly bizarre iterations, but that in the process of revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, humanity turns to history for reference. In doing so, political movements adopt the masks of the past, presenting themselves in the garb of ghosts. This is as true of the attitude taken toward or by reactionary movements as it is of the attitude taken toward or by revolutionary ones. Whilst the possibility of fascist dictatorship is by no means foreclosed at our present conjecture. Indeed, such formations appear to be coming to fruition in at least India and Brazil. It is this process which stands behind many attempts to define our present age as a repetition of the monsters of the 20th century. Whilst this is perfectly understandable, a sanitized view of fascism forming the cornerstone and limit to the teaching of history in many bourgeois societies since the war, we must insist that it is counterproductive. This is meant as much in self-criticism as it is in criticism. Again, Marx is clear, arguing that whilst the revolutionaries of ages past found strength in such an evocation of history, as this process allowed them to mystify their real political content and so secure the support of the masses in the establishment of new rulers, proletarian revolutionaries are allowed no such luxury. The proletariat is unique in its position, as no new form of property compels it to victory, but only its conscious activity. This necessitates a concrete, materialist understanding of its position. Equally, to defeat its enemies requires a clear understanding of the concrete, material forces driving their motion in all of their historical complexity. If we lend the reactionary forces which confront us the veil of the fascists' march, then we lend them an instrument of ideological terror and confusion. Whilst our account of these modern forces in this film is still severely lacking, as any account of history still in motion must necessarily be, it is hoped that our sketch has served to provide a basis to undermine such a weapon. This is to say that our intent throughout this work has not been to provide definitive answers on the character of the forces confronting us, but simply the basis for better questions.
Thank you.